Today we begin a series. I haven't done one of those for a while, but looking into the summer, we're going to do one for the month of July, starting today, and then we'll start another one in August. And yes, even in September, we've looked ahead and are excited about that. But today we begin one called God's Greatest or Toughest Competition. The five subjects we're going to hit are these. Today, patriotism, individualism, adventurism, moralism, and relativism. It's really based on the premise that the good is often the enemy of the best. And so none of these topics, matter of fact, if I took every topic, I could find for you something good and valuable about it. And yet, if you look at it in terms of how it can, in fact, be in competition with God, it makes you wonder about how we can take the good and it becomes something not so good. So on the Sunday before July the 4th, the birthday of our country from its independence from the Kingdom of Great Britain at the time, we're going to address the issue of patriotism. Now, today is high on information, so let me just encourage you. You notice the outline is a little more stuffed than normal, and I even had to cut back from that. So just know that it's there. I wanted to give you all of these reasons, and of course I would have had 3 pages, but the first 2 questions are these. What are the reasons for Christian citizenship? What are the reasons we have that bring us to the point of believing in this whole thing called Christian citizenship? Let me walk through about 5, and I will kind of pause after each one. But if you're one of those folks who wants the whole outline sometime, I'm always an email away. You can have the full and complete outline. But first of all, America has more liberty than any other nation in history. I hope you know that, and it is continuing in ways that we can only imagine. I mean, every time I turn around, I marvel at the incredible liberty that we have as a nation. Secondly, gratitude for blessings must be expressed, or it will in fact be replaced by apathy or indifference. And that's really where I come in today. I don't want that to happen. There is an ongoing thought of discernment to me, and I'm going to plant this seed in your mind, and then I'll come back to it. But what's the difference between cynicism and skepticism? What's the difference? Because I think you and I, when we take things seriously, and I certainly take my Christian citizenship seriously, I've got to draw the line between skepticism and cynicism. We will deal with that a little bit later. Thirdly, because of political liberty, we have the greatest freedom to worship God that mankind has ever known. And if you've ever been to another country, and I've just read where an Ohio student was killed in some of the riots overseas, and my heart breaks over the unrest that is there and how lives are simply taken in the midst of the battle. Fourthly, every generation of Christians must learn the heritage of their ancestors. It's awfully important that we set aside time to talk about this whole idea of Christian citizenship, because if you and I don't have a commitment to religious liberty, it will in fact go away. Independence from political authorities has to be a part. So we will mention in a moment, I won't take time for it now, but this denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, has stood tall in terms of declaring the separation of church and state. Now that does not mean separation of the church from the state, because we are here. We'll mention more of that later. But nevertheless, every generation, and it's on our generation, that we have to make sure that we hold on to the heritage of our ancestors. And finally, Christian involvement absolutely makes a difference. Christian involvement absolutely makes a difference. And that's why I always say, and I read James Wallace of the Sojourners very carefully, and he's big about, God has nothing to do with blue or red, but he has everything to do with our country. So Christian involvement makes a difference. G.K. Chesterton said it best, and I may even reference it later, but that Christianity has not been tried and found wanting, it has been found difficult and not tried. And I would agree with that. So those are the reasons for Christian citizenship. So what are the concerns over Christian citizenship? And there are some. First of all, the gospel is nonpartisan. I mentioned to you that it's not Republican or Democrat or even independent. Secondly, the gospel impacts all of life. Every inch, every space of life, the gospel impacts it. So are politics included in that? Yes, they are. And so we have to include that. Thirdly, if Christians are not involved in shaping our government, we in effect turn it over to those who will shape it in a different way. So you and I will just tell you, if you don't have a voting record, I would highly encourage you to have a voting record. You say, well, I don't always know how to vote. Well, guess what? You need to. And I would just say to you, vote, vote, vote. And if your party or your particular persuasion doesn't win, continue to pray for those that are in charge of our country, even so much so as even in charge of Covington. I don't know if you read the article this week about our commissioners and our mayor and all the uproar about all that, and I just want to go, and I hopefully can finish my book and take it to them, and it's called Stay in the Room Relationships. Learn how to set the appropriate boundaries, set the appropriate issues in your lives, and get along, at least hopefully behind closed doors. Fourthly, patriotism is both appropriate and it is proper for the people of God. It's a wonderful thing. I have watched in my own life. I was one of those Vietnam kids that, we drew numbers back then, and my number was 327, so my likelihood of going was not very high, but also I was a student at the time, so you had that deferment as well. But my dad served, and I often looked at his pictures. He was actually an MP in the Army and served his country proudly, and I've often had a certain level of pride for that. My best friend, as I've related to a couple of you, that was in the Army 2 weeks before he was to come home from Vietnam, was killed, and so I oftentimes think about him and drive by that cemetery here in Latonia. He was a Holy Cross kid, and I loved Gary Sherberg dearly. So we're going to look at the whole issue of patriotism and Christian citizenship as it relates to what Paul says in Romans 13. I'm going to take time to read this whole passage, or I may move quickly through sections of it, but I'm going to take time. Just know that this is chapter 13, and he's been leading up to this through 12 other chapters, so we'll take perspective of that. Verse 1, and I'm reading from the Message today. Be a good citizen. All governments are under God. Insofar as there's peace and order, it is God's order. So live responsibly as a citizen, and if you are irresponsible to the state, then you're irresponsible with God, and God will hold you responsible. Duly constituted authorities are only a threat if you are trying to get by with something. Decent citizens should have nothing to fear. Do you want to be on good terms with your government? Be a responsible citizen, and you will get on just fine, the government working to your advantage. But if you are breaking the rules right and left, watch out. The police are not just there to be admired in their uniforms. I like how he says that. God also, he says, has an interest in keeping order, and he uses them to do it. And that is why you live responsibly. Not just to avoid punishment, but also because it is the right way to live. That is also why you pay taxes, so that an orderly way of life can be maintained. To fulfill your obligation as a citizen. Pay your taxes, pay your bills, and respect your leaders. Don't run up debts except for the huge debt of love that you owe each other. And when you love each other, as you complete what the law has been after all along. The law code: don't sleep with another person's spouse. Do not take someone's life. Do not take what is not yours. Do not always be wanting what you do not have. And any other do not you can think of finally adds up to this: love other people as well as you do yourself. You can't go wrong when you love others. When you add up everything in the law code, the sum total is love. So for the first 12 chapters of Romans, he's been laying the groundwork. In detail, he's been telling them about how how man has been standing in hostility against God. He talks about how that man has gone through an entrapment to idols. He talks about confusion that mankind has experienced inwardly because of this relationship. And finally, he talks about the alienation that we have in social relationships. And so now he gets to this point, and he breathes deep in chapter 12, verse 1, where he begins to make the transition. And I will come back to this later in this series, this verse. It says, present your bodies as a living, holy sacrifice, which is your what? Spiritual service of worship. It means present yourself as an act of worship to God to be used and make an impact. Paul, as a political theorist, makes some important points in this brief paragraph. And so here in verse 3, he says, be a responsible citizen. Paul teaches, first of all, that God appoints the social order. Now, I know if your party is not serving right now in the areas that you want your party to be serving, if you have such, then you're going to have a difficulty with that, but it nevertheless is the case. If you subdivide that, as I did, the first part to support that is the government is a provision of God for our good. I pull out the verses, the first two verses there that I just read for you. Be a good citizen. All governments are under God. Interpretation of the word appoints there, I would simply say that I get a little nervous when we have theologians starting to say God was doing this with this, and God was doing this with this, and that's why God did this. I get a little concerned about all that. What I would simply say with the word appoints is that he allows those that are in authority, and that's the key word, he allows those in authority to do what is good, and they're not always the case. I will always remember forever a conversation, I hope I remember this exactly right, between Ron Peace and Winona King at the back door one day. Now, if you know anything about those two characters, one of them is living, of course, and is here today. The other one is not, bless her heart. But there are two very different people politically. If you don't know that, then you don't know either one of them, because to know them would be to know that they are. I will never forget standing at the back door one day, and they were walking together, and as I remember the conversation, it went something like this. This is her Republican ear, Ron was helping her understand, and this was her Democratic ear. And so she was hoping that she could hear out of both sides, to which she's sitting there listening, and she leans over to me to her Republican ear, and she says, yeah, I'm deaf out of this one. I will forever remember her saying that, because it was classic of the discussion, not only that oftentimes went between them, but also the respect that the two of them had for each other. That's one of the golden memories that I will always have of Winona. So the government is a provision of God for our good, but secondly, the government exists to uphold right and to overthrow wrong. The verse I choose there is verses 3 and 4, and I pull out the lines. I've kind of bolded them. Be a responsible citizen. God also has an interest in keeping order, and he uses them to do it. Now let's go back to that distinction that I want to make between skepticism and cynicism. I did a little, as you might expect, I'm a wordsmith. I looked up the words because I'd been feeling this tension for a while. The word cynicism refers to reflecting a belief that human conduct is motivated primarily by self-interest. Skepticism is reflecting a belief that true knowledge in a particular area is uncertain. Now, let me make a distinction for you. I believe that I am a skeptic, or at least I have some skepticism about me. In other words, there's a part of me that questions things. There's a part of me that looks at things below the surface. But I never want to reach the point in my life, in my faith, in my journey, in my experience as a citizen, to be cynical. To go to the point that I think it's all hogwash. I think I will go to my grave believing that God can redeem all of us if we will let him. And so to me, the difference between skepticism and cynicism is making that move that simply I cannot make because God's love averts me from doing so. It directs me from doing so. It won't allow me to become a cynic. As much as there are moments when I want to throw my shoe at the television in what I see or hear, and as much as there are moments when I just want to push back and say, no more, no more, no more, I refuse to become a cynic. because God's love won't allow me to do that. Secondly, first, Paul teaches that God appoints the social order. Secondly, the social order is good, but it is in fact not ultimate. Now, what he's saying here is, before two sentences appear in the paragraph, Paul has both honored what he would call the social wholeness of how we're all connected together, but he's also limited it by saying that it has limitations and its scale, it's ultimate. Verse 1, insofar as there is peace and order, it is God's order. Now, the New American Standard, which I read for a study, says be subject to the governing authorities, and the word authorities there comes from the Greek word dominion. And that's a strong word, but there is no authority except from God. Now, I almost did this, and I even regret it a little bit. I was going to bring an umbrella up here. I was going to put an umbrella up over my head. Because I live under the authority of God. I live under that. And so for me, when I encounter political things or things in our community or things that I don't like or whatever, I don't take over here and put my authority. The authority of God is with me all the time. Now, what I would love is that I could sit down and talk to people and say, okay, come under the authority of God with me. Some of them would do that, and some of them would not do that. But when I come with my authority under God, what does that do? How does that color my relationship with people? Do they say, oh man, he's just all law and all moral and all sticky and, I don't want to talk to him? Or do they sense, yes, he's under the authority of God, but he is loving and caring. And I don't know, I don't understand all that authority under God stuff, but I do understand them, and they care about me. And they live a life that's honorable, and I can't take it from them. The social order is good, but it is not ultimate. Thirdly, Paul's portrait of the social order is in ideal terms. If you want to see how one is another passage that is not in ideal terms, but is more historically conditioned, go over to Revelation 13 sometime. I mean, that one is an indictment of authority, political authority. So what Paul has done in Romans is to talk about the ideal. It's the portrait, the perfect Olin Mills portrait. They've cleaned up all the little marks, and this is how he wants it to look like when we are at our best doing it. So let me remind you what the separation of church and state is, just briefly. And it's a liberty that we need to watch very carefully. Separation of church and state means basically that we remain separate, that we operate separately, that the church cannot come in here and tell me how I will perform weddings, or it cannot come in here and tell me how I will do certain things, that we as a congregation have the separation of church and state. But it also behooves me, and that's why you heard me last year with some consternation with two groups that have a history of never coming out and supporting a candidate who were both religious organizations, and both of them did so. One of them no longer has a job with the Southern Baptist Convention. They, because of other reasons too, have moved, Richard Land, who was a friend of mine. But the history of that role that he had as ethics person for our convention, he crossed the line and supported a candidate. I just will tell you, you can't do that and stand in the position that I stand in. And our Billy Graham Association did the same thing. And I think you can do all of the other stuff. You can talk about the morals, you can talk about the issues, but I think when you cross that line, you confuse our separation of church and state. Now, do I have minister folks that do that? Sure, they do it, and they shake their fist at the government, and I am just one that chooses not to do that. But we are a part, and in case you don't think we are a part of the government, I will just tell you that the church property is registered at the courthouse, and we either pay taxes or we accept the tax exemption. So we are a part, but it's the old in but not of, and so it's a tension that we, particularly our denomination, has held very proudly through the years. Number 4, Paul's intent is not so much political as pastoral. Now, I hope you don't forget that. Paul knew what he was talking about here. His intent is to talk to the social order, but he's trying to do it from a pastoral standpoint. Now, Paul, who writes these words, knows the Roman government very, very well. Matter of fact, he has visited several of their prisons. He knows the Roman government. He knows that John the Baptist was killed by Herod Antipas. He remembers that Jesus was in fact crucified under Pilate, and he knows that Paul himself was beaten numerous times. I think it is important to recognize that this is not just political, that it was pastoral. Pastoral message speaking to, first of all, the ascetics. The ascetics wanted nothing to do with the world. They wanted to hide over here in the corner like we could do in our church. Let's just be our own little cult, Latonia Baptist Church, and hate the world, but come in here each Sunday to get enough of the dose of God that we can just escape from our world. That's ascetics. Paul was dealing with the ascetics on one side and the libertines on the other side. Now, the libertines, now their story is a little bit different. They said it did not matter what a person did in the world. Their theology was, we have been saved by grace, therefore we don't have any obligation to live out our faith. We've been saved by grace. We can't do anything to get it or to lose it. And so the libertines would simply say, Paul references living in the new age. We're going to live the new age, but that is a perversion of what Paul was saying. In verses 8 through 12 of chapter 13, concentrate on the motive. He says, owe nothing to anyone except to love them. Now that's where it gets interesting. We've heard a lot lately about Fifth Amendment. The DOMA thing that came down this week and also the IRS thing that came down, both of them reference the Fifth Amendment. Now, if you haven't read the Fifth Amendment lately in your devotions, let me just read it for you very quickly. It's very cumbersome, but the phrase really that it was there, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise an infamous crime unless a presentation or indictment, The part that's been important recently have been this section. Nor shall anyone be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, remember the IRS thing, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that's where the DOMA thing came down. And my point on all this is that too many of us are Fifth Amendment Christians. Fifth Amendment Christians are those who refuse to testify to the faith that is in fact inside of them. And let me say it as clearly as I can say it. You can't share what you don't know. You can't influence somebody that you don't love, and you can't give what you don't have. So it's incredibly important for you and I to have a willingness to witness that comes from a willingness to witness for right and for good. In other words, I can't not stand against injustice. I can't not stand for what I understand to be right. I can't. That's a part of my faith experience that absolutely drives me. I would not be fair if I did not mention Jesus in all of this, obviously, because he had a very clear word. He was asked about taxes and that kind of thing, and he says, as a matter of fact, it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of the synoptic gospels, and he says to them, pay to the emperor what belongs to him, and pay to God what belongs to God. Now, what is he saying? He's saying that the problem of patriotism comes when we wed God to our country, our nations, and our ideals. And just as Jesus made a separation about the emperor's possessions and God's possessions, so you and I need to keep our allegiance to God and to country in check. Now, the second principle is one that speaks to the whole issue of my country, right or wrong. The Old Testament prophets were very clear. Go back and read some of them, Amos and Micah and Jeremiah and Isaiah. They were crystal clear that only when you and we move in God's direction are you and we called God's people. Now, we will address lots of these issues under moralism and relativism, but let me just say, as much as I'd love to say that God is the thriving influence in our country right now, you and I both know that that's not the case. And God is seemingly to be moving in Europe and South Africa much more than he's moving here. And I do think it has something to do with who we are as a people. Anytime you beat the drum and say, God is on our side, I just want to make it very clear, I want to make sure that I'm on his side. So it leads me to the final and important conclusion, and that is this: national repentance will always start with personal repentance. Now, what does that mean? Christians are compelled to support the governing authorities as long as we can remain loyal to Christ in doing so. Now, that's the distinction. It's important to remember that only when Paul was ordered to keep preaching, to stop preaching, did he disobey. Now, mark this well. Only when he was ordered to stop preaching did he disobey authority. And if you know your New Testament history, you know what happened to him. He was beheaded. New Testament scholar J.K. Barrett says love is not Christian love if it cannot include love for the person who differs from me in every way. Well, folks, you better get ready for that, because that's going to be the case. It already is the case. We've changed more radically as a country than I ever thought we could. But I love this country, and I'm going to love my way through it. One final word. I can barely pronounce this guy's name. I did a little history this week. Nicolae Ceausescu, a Romanian communist politician who served as the general secretary of Romanian Communist Party for a number of years, 1965 to 1989, when he was killed by a firing squad, he and his wife. But the story that I read and went back and checked on was the story that evidently in the Helsinki Agreement, believe this or not, that he was violating the Helsinki Agreement because he was not allowing people to bring Bibles into Romania. So in violation, he said he would accept them, and he did. He accepted them in until finally they looked around. They couldn't find any Bibles anywhere, and they found out, what happened to all the Bibles? Not only did he send the police out to destroy all the Bibles, but he went further than just the new Bibles in. If anybody was found with a Bible, he wanted to get rid of the Bible. Now, as I read that story, I said, why? Why would he be afraid of the Bible? Well, the same reason that Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar and Caesar and Louis XVI, and the same way that Castro and Gorbachev and all the others, those that deal with apartheid in South Africa and oppression in Afghanistan, the book teaches freedom. It does. It teaches the deepest freedom. But in that, it teaches the paradox of freedom. It means that Christ, who was crucified, who was in bonds, has now made it possible for us to be free. Now, what are we free from? We are free from sin. But the rest of the story is we are free from something in order to do and to be something. Christ set us free not to simply be free in our grace. As I've told you 100 times, grace never happens to you, but that it happens through you. Christ has set us free from, in order that we might have the freedom to do something. I think it would be understatement to say that we are suffering a crisis of integrity and priorities in our country today. I don't know about you, but I'm not going to get cynical. I'm going to get busy. I thought this week I'm probably going to join the Downtown Rotary of Covington. I was a part of the Rotary in Nashville, and I feel like I made an impact. I don't know. I just feel like I need to be a little more involved in loving people. And that's one of the ways that I can do that, as well as one of the other things I did this week, knocking on a door and helping a mother with the money that you give to our benevolence. A mother who has 4 children under the age of 6, buy diapers and food for her children. We've got to be the expression of love because we've been set free from something in order to be something. That's powerful. That's Christ living in you and in me. If you're here this morning and you don't know about the reality that I've been talking about, let me encourage you that being set free from sin sets you free to be something. And we would love to walk with you in order to do that. If you're here today, you've not surrendered your heart to the Lord, and this old political stuff is very confusing to you, well, welcome to our party. It is never that easy, but it's not something that we're going to ignore. We're going to stay in it. With the love of Christ, we're going to stay in it. If you're here and you want to be a part of a fellowship of believers, we would love for you to be here and work with us, serve with us.